Jane-Michèle Clark, Director of Strategy for Cloud Managed Networks, a well-respected firm that provides business process management and IT advice, along with hardware, software, and cloud-based solutions. Jane-Michèle is with us today to talk about current cloud security concerns and the changing nature of cybercrime and what you can do to protect your firm, its systems and data, and your stakeholders' personal data. Jane-Michèle, welcome.
Thank you. Hi, Nick. How are you?
Good. Now, we're going to discuss cloud and cloud security in a moment. But first, I'd like to talk about what's changing related to illegal online activity and how it impacts us all. I understand that the rate of cybercrime has been escalating dramatically since the beginning of the year. Can you talk a little bit more about this to us?
Unfortunately, that's true, Nick. Every 26 seconds, there is a cyber attack happening somewhere in the globe. The FBI and Interpol estimate that before the year is done, there will be 33 billion accounts that will be breached. Let's put this in perspective. That means that every single hour, every single day, there are 96 new victims of cybercrime. That's a pretty scary number.
It is a scary number, and from what I understand, there has been a corresponding increase in the cost of these crimes. In 2022, we read the figure was 6 trillion, and experts are estimating the figure will rise to 10.5 trillion by 2025, less than 2 years away. There's a 175% increase there within 2 years. Are most of these costs related to ransomware and the cost associated with, of course, restoring the operations?
Well, although the ransom fee, if it gets paid by the company, represents a very interesting sum at times, it's a fraction of the cost. Most of the costs associated with remediating a situation after you've been breached fall into 4 different categories. The first is in the investigation and remediation portion, and that's about 40% of the figure that you cited. These are the costs that are associated with trying to figure out what went wrong in the first place, the identification portion of it, then resolving the problem, and then getting the company back up and running again.
Well, quite, but is there anything that can be done to reduce the remediation costs?
Yeah, there are actually quite a few things that can be done. The first is to have a very solid breach preparedness plan in place. And if people need one, they can download it from our site if they would like. But when you're putting this together, you need to involve all of your stakeholders, but especially all of the various people within your company, because you've got to figure out what departments, what processes are going to be impacted should you lose a portion or all of your network all at once. So you want to make sure that it's put together, it's been vetted by everybody, and then you need to print it, especially the first pages that tell people what to do in the event that their system collapses. Because if you can't get to your server, there's no way you're going to be able to know what to do next. So you print it, you vet it, you print it, you post it. And the second thing is that you need to make sure that you are backing up your systems regularly. You want to back up the data. You want to back up all of your operating systems, as well as any special configurations or customization that was done to those systems for you. And you need to keep a list of who has access to what. Because for a lot of companies, just reestablishing those permissions can take a lot of time. The one thing is that you want to back up and you want to have your backup automated as much as possible. And for that reason, we often recommend a program like Veeam. But regardless of whose program you use, you want to make sure that your data, your operating systems, all of that backup is now residing on at least 2 different servers, ones that are located in different geographic regions. The third thing you've got to think about is potentially engaging a disaster recovery team. But even if you decide to go it alone, there are a couple of things that you need to do. You need to practice it on a regular basis, because there's a huge difference between backing up your data and then being able to restore it again to pre-attack status. So what we say to people is, check it out, do it routinely, go right down to bare metal and try to restore again as you start to go. Fourth thing is actually work with a disaster recovery as a service firm. You may be paying a little bit on a monthly basis, but most firms, if you don't use their services, they allow you to roll it over into the next year. The advantage is twofold. One, if you work with them up front, they get to know your system. They've got certain foundational elements in place already. So God forbid something should happen. And the joke is, it's not a matter of if, but when. They're prepared. But the other advantage with working with a team, especially one that has their own SOC, especially SOC 2, is that this is something they do all the time. Your team is going to have other things that it needs to focus on in the event of a breach. These guys can get going sometimes within less than 30 minutes, and to be able to make sure that your systems are not going to get further impacted by whatever it is that's taking you out in the first place. The team that we work with regularly says, if they make a joke of it, they say, who are you going to call? Call Ghostbusters, because we know even if you've not been working with us before, that, as I said, within 30 minutes, they're already got a good team jumping into action. And then the fifth thing, you want to deploy a software system, something such as Cisco's Secure Network Analytics, because that's going to give you visibility and security intelligence across all systems across your entire organization, before, during, and after the attack. And it's going to continually monitor your network. It's going to give you real-time threat detection, incident response, forensics, and you're going to need those. Your insurance company is going to need those so they can figure out what went wrong at what point. And it can be an important consideration when they're paying out a claim. It also helps with your ongoing threat hunting, which is a really important part of maintaining your network security.
Now, you said that the costs associated with cyber attacks fall into 4 categories, investigation and remediation being the first. What are the other 3 there?
Oh, absolutely. Every one of these is business interruption. Every single moment that your company is down, that you can't sell your products, that you can't manufacture items or deliver the services that you need, will cost your company thousands of dollars in profit or revenue. And if it's a critical infrastructure that's been targeted, or a hospital, in that case, then it can actually literally be a matter of life and death. The next one is brand reputation. I mean, if you keep going down or you don't handle it well when your system doesn't work and customers start to complain, it could be a huge impact on future business. Right now, in August of 2023, LinkedIn faced some challenges because a lot of its accounts ended up being frozen out. 11 days later, people are still having problems accessing it. And when you've spent decades in some instances building a network, you've got 15,000 or more connections, having that wiped out and having to start all over again, that's a huge impact to future people wanting to use that particular product or service. The last one is something that we don't hear as much about, quite frankly, and it's becoming a much larger cost in terms of what happens when you get breached. And that's the theft of your corporate strategies, of your intellectual properties. I'm going to ask you to cut to a slide here, because if you see from this first slide, there's a disturbing amount of information, corporate information, that's available for sale on the dark web. This first one comes from Aviation. It's a company that has been offering ransomware as a service to criminals since 2021. And it's known for targeting critical infrastructure, government and other public facilities, financial institutions, critical manufacturing. Most of these types of services, they have little clauses that say you may not use our services to go after nuclear power plants and other things, but not Aviation. So they've been targeting firms in Canada, the US, Europe, including companies such as Germany, Spain, the UK, Belgium, countries a little further afield from me, like Taiwan, Turkey, Saudi, all of them. No country, it seems, is immune. This next slide, it offers up the Cambrian group, which, with you being in the UK, is probably a name familiar to you because it provides residential, educational, and other services to support social, emotional, and mental health needs of children and young adults across the country. And in this case, personal information from a very vulnerable population is being offered up for sale. Now let's look at this next one. This next one is only about selling Global Mining Products catalog of services. Well, a lot of this is information that Global Mining doesn't want everybody knowing that it offers, things that it doesn't make available to people, let alone telling them what it's going to cost. So having this information out there is a huge concern, because in this case, it's just their offerings. But in other cases, you'll find that companies' proprietary information, things, not just IP, but their trade secrets, their business plans, it's all getting leaked. The estimate is that now, every single month, at least 2 companies around the globe are forced to close their doors. Their business gets destroyed because these bad actors, they get in and they sell to some unscrupulous group of people the patents, the processes, and the client list. So these companies go on now to replicate the products, They go after their customers and say, hey, we've got this product, the same one that you've been using, for 20, 30% less. And it will wipe out these companies because there's very little recourse they have right now. And sadly, this is an escalating figure.
Jane-Michèle, you've given some pretty worrying examples there through those slides and case histories that you've actually shown us. But I guess my question is, like, who is being targeted? What is the thinking behind this? As an individual, should I be less worried now? And it sounds like it's all about business. Or am I missing something here? Is there a very clear strategy behind these attacks?
Yeah, absolutely. You should be worried. Individual smaller hackers, they do go after just about anybody, including individual accounts. But there is a very strategic and organized approach to what's happening. Right now, and for several years, the mush sector has been the greatest, has had the biggest bullseye on its back. So municipalities, universities, schools, healthcare, they have been the number one group that has been targeted over the last 4 or 5 years. In fact, last year, 30% of all large data breaches occurred with hospitals. And when you think about it, it's not that surprising, because if you're going to create a fake ID, you really want somebody that's never applied for a credit, applied for a mortgage, does not yet have a credit rating. Those are kids or people that have recently died that had a great credit rating. And where else can you find those besides schools? It's the hospital, it's the healthcare units. And that's one of the reasons that they're being targeted. Now, we talk about major headlines around the world, and most of those focus on the large multinational organizations. But you know what? Most of the companies that are being targeted are actually the smaller size enterprises. They're the ones that have somewhere between 100 and 1,000 employees, anywhere from, say, 50 million to $1 billion in business. But equally plagued by attacks right now are slightly smaller firms, whether it's in North America and Europe. Those are really being targeted, usually for corporate espionage reasons, as we talked about. But regardless of why they're going after them, in 90% of cases, they're also getting the employee and the other stakeholders' personal data. And that's one of the reasons why you've got to absolutely safeguard those personal files however you possibly can.
Jane-Michèle, you talked about the major news stories, and there was a massive headline in November 22 when it was revealed, and I find this quite hard to just say, even though it's fact, that a hacker was selling personal information of some 500 million WhatsApp users from 84 countries on the dark web. Now, this cyber crook, he claimed to have up-to-date personal details of 32 million users from the US, 11 million from the UK, and 6 million from Germany, amongst others. It seems, frankly, incredible that a hacker could gain access to so much valuable intelligence. Has something changed in terms of who is hacking and how?
Yeah, it has. And unfortunately, Interpol verifies that that is a true statement in terms of those WhatsApp addresses. But there's no doubt there has been a sea change in terms of how cybercrime is being perpetrated today. You think about you see the memes of those little hoodie clad guys in a basement, the faces that you can't see. Well, those small petty cyber criminals, they've morphed into well-organized and very well-funded business owners. Those hoodies have given way to Armani and Hugo Boss.
Now, this is the second time you've suggested that cyber criminals are far more organized today than was ever the case. Even a couple of years ago, it's changed dramatically. Can you expand on that for me more, please?
Certainly. I mean, hacking in one form or another, it's always been big business. I mean, it's been a very lucrative pursuit, which is why so many people do it, of course. But now we're seeing that these criminals, and they are criminals, have started to organize themselves along corporate lines. You're seeing all the organizational structural pieces in place that you see with large companies. And as part of that, we're also seeing there has been a dramatic increase, almost twofold, threefold increase in the number of access brokers that are out there. Now, an access broker, it's similar to a real estate broker. So imagine that a real estate broker has lists of properties that are available for sale. The access brokers have lists of data that you can actually go out and buy quite easily on the dark web. Let me show you a couple of examples, because there's been a dramatic increase in the number of listings you're going to be able to find. This first one, you can see there's a vendor who's advertising credit card sales. You can buy them in bulk, as you can see here, for as little as $350 US. You too can own, no, I'm teasing a little bit, but for $350 US, you can get up to 50 cards with anywhere from $1,000 to $5,000 as their credit limit. And they also tell you how much is left on the card, so that you can say, okay, great, I want to make this purchase, but I know I can't spend more than X, otherwise I'll go over the card's limit. What's really scary is that anybody can get access to this. They can get access to a .onion extension, which is where you'll find this, simply by downloading a Tor browser. You can't get to it through your regular browser, but you certainly can easily, and too easily, in my opinion, access the dark web these days. Let's go to the next slide. If you look at it, here you get an opportunity maybe to become a US citizen if you want. For $4,000, you get to have a passport, and they say it's bulletproof. Bulletproof passport, driver's license, social insurance number, birth certificate, all of these things. But it seems a little sketchy, because they're asking for, say $1,000 deposit, and you look at the screen, you'll see that it's a $1,500 first charge. Well, they're sketchy. It's not surprising. But maybe you don't want to live in the US. Let's look at the next one. Let's look at the next example. Maybe you'd prefer to be a middle-aged woman living in Canada. This is a Quebecois woman, and if you want, not only can, for $25, you can get her identity, but pay a little bit more and you can find out her credit rating as well. Maybe, though, identity theft isn't your business, or creating fake IDs is not how you make your money. Maybe your business model is simply to be able to earn a little bit of extra cash and do different things. Well, in that case, you've got a whole slew of options. If you look at this next slide, you'll see that this purveyor of different accounts, from PayPal to Amazon and so on, gives lots of opportunities for people to be able to start becoming their own cyber criminals.
Jane-Michèle, these are very sobering examples and make it very clear that there have been significant developments in cybercrime. But it does also, believe it or not, provide me with a backdrop to talk about our next session on cloud and cloud migration and cloud security. Because let's be honest, it would be easy to focus on all the negatives, which we have just done, and you providing many of the solutions and advice on how to deal with those. But the pace of innovation and change is absorbing, and being absorbing, it brings lots of positive aspects to our IT industry. Now, although cloud computing has started, what I think it was first in the 1960s, it wasn't until Amazon launched AWS in 2006, many years later, that people started talking about the cloud as being something other than those fluffy white clouds, which we're at last beginning to see now during our rather late summer. But even then, companies were slow to adopt the cloud to some degree, because there was insufficient applications available, unquestionably. But that is no longer the case. And in part because the pandemic forced us all to change the way we work, cloud adoption has almost doubled in the past 3 years. So with nearly 90% of companies around the world already using cloud to some extent in their businesses, you would think that cloud migration would be old hat by now. Yet cloud usage and security, they remain big news, don't they? Why is that?
You're right, Nick. Cloud is no longer a novel topic. It's actually become table stakes today in terms of business. That being said, less than half of all organizations are cloud native or fully cloud enabled. For instance, less than 60% of corporate data actually resides in the cloud, and fewer than 30% of corporate processes actually can be found in the cloud. From our partners, and we work with many of them, as you know, we know that nearly 60% of companies are looking to optimize their cloud usage over the next 12 to 18 months. And at the same time, they're going to be migrating more and more of their workloads and their manufacturing processes and other things that they use from an operational point of view up into the cloud. We've also seen a pretty significant increase in companies that are moving from on-premises software to having software as a service, for a few reasons, actually. As you mentioned, these applications have had a chance to mature. For these reasons, cloud-related services are expected to double over the next year or so, next year and a half, to reach $830 billion by 2025.
Now that is rapid growth by anyone's definition. And in the face of it, some people are saying that 2023 is in fact a turning point for cloud security, because as the increasing numbers of IT specialists are beginning to just sound the alarm, caution about the risks inherent in the technology. That being the case, can you expand on this for us a little bit?
Yes, of course. It's a little bit like a chicken and egg situation. As more cloud native applications get developed, and I'm talking about robust, truly useful applications, more and more organizations are adopting cloud solutions. And there's a couple of reasons for this. One is that makes it very easy for companies to quickly, confidently, and cost effectively improve their own capabilities. And at the same time, they're able to leverage their OPEX budgets rather than having to now contribute to capital expenses. That overhead has been the traditional way that people have moved forward in the past. As I said, chicken and egg. As more organizations subscribe to these cloud-based services, the more these applications proliferate. And so on, the cycle continues. Unfortunately, this also expands the attack surface, along with all the vulnerabilities that cyber criminals are increasingly learning to exploit.
Okay, what do you mean by attack surface?
An attack surface is made up of all the different ways that a bad actor can gain unauthorized access to any of your system, anywhere in your organization. And it includes digital and physical entry points. So let's look at it. The physical ones will include all of your endpoints. And the biggest concern will have to do with your unmanaged assets. So let's think about it. Somebody gets a promotion, they get a new computer, leave the company, any of these things. If that laptop or that console is not disposed of properly, it becomes a liability. Frequently, when they're not being used, they even fall off the inventory, the inventory of assets, and it becomes a lot harder to make sure they're being taken care of. Well, without IT there to manage the asset, it's not getting patched regularly. It's got less security now than any of the other devices that are connected to the system. We call these orphans. Well, these orphans act as beacons to the bad guys because they know that they represent a lower level of security. They look for those. They also look for computers, and in this case, it will happen that they may be connecting to a port that most of the other devices and the organizations aren't using. That vulnerability, it's like a beacon to these bad guys. And programs have been developed to enable them to go after these vulnerabilities, to ferret them out, as you will, and be able to attack. The other way it becomes a problem is that these companies will sometimes discard the hardware without having wiped the unit of login credentials. And again, this now becomes fodder for cyber criminal activity.
But Jane-Michèle, what about the digital ones?
Digital attack surfaces will include vulnerabilities that get created by poor programming, weak passwords, defunct operating systems that were inherited, but mostly the problems come from unpatched programs. These are especially problematic. Last year, 28% of all successful breaches were attributed to poor patch management. And unfortunately, the cyber criminals are well aware of this and have developed special programs that let them go in, find these vulnerabilities, and exploit the security gaps before they get patched. And these attack surfaces, they are constantly shifting and expanding, and they're expanding into the cloud as well.
But look, you're highlighting vulnerabilities in the cloud, understandably, yet a lot of cloud providers stress, in fact, that they have very extensive security protocols in place. And therefore, to the uninitiated, the person making the first steps to cloud, they might think this is relatively safe. And that is the case, isn't it?
For the most part, the major cloud providers, AWS, Microsoft Azure, Google Cloud, are pretty secure. And this is a point of interest. These three companies, they provide 2/3 of corporate cloud services, and a little over 70% of the public cloud is controlled by these three. They're all pretty secure. In fact, the top 8, you're not going to have many problems with, but that doesn't mean they're invincible. In May of 2022, 6.5 terabytes of data that belonged to Pegasus Airline was exposed because of an AWS breach. July 11th of this year, Microsoft announced that a group of Chinese hackers that goes by the name Storm 0558 was able to gain access to government agency and individual accounts, which is what you're concerned earlier, Nick, because of a breach there. And then they use these stolen credentials to access a whole lot more accounts as well. Now, that hole has been patched, but it really underscores the vulnerability of even the largest of the cloud providers.
Would it be accurate to say, or fair to say, that corporations should feel secure as long as they use one of the big three, or even perhaps one of the top 8 global cloud providers?
Oh, I wish that were true, Nick, but it's not. Companies are far less likely to encounter security problems with a major provider. But a lot of IT departments have become a little bit complacent when it comes to cloud security, expecting that the cloud provider is going to accept full responsibility for that security. But the onus is actually on individual corporations to protect their perimeters. And unfortunately, most of the cloud related problems that we've seen over the last 12 months or so stem from improper or inadequate security practices on the parts of the users.
Now, that is interesting. So what are some of the greatest areas in which cloud users are most vulnerable? And I guess the logical follow through is, what can they do to make themselves more secure?
For those of you actively involved in coding your systems networks or in other parts of your system architecture, there's a really easy thing that you can do to check. Go and see if your credentials have been hard coded into your source control management systems. Unit 42 surveyed thousands of organizations around the world. And what they learned is that in over 80% of cases, these credentials actually are available through that particular source code management system. And there's a huge vulnerability there. But the good news is that it's an easy hole to be fixed. And the reason you want to do it is that when cyber criminals get access, by having those credentials, they can go laterally and vertically within the organization. As I said, it's a huge vulnerability, but one that's very easy to shore up. Another big problem is improperly configured cloud environments. In fact, nearly 2/3 of all cyber incidents in 2022 were the result of misconfigurations when it came to the permissions that are being granted to individuals and to groups. And in most cases, far too much latitude is being granted. For this reason, companies are starting to adopt a different way of looking at things. They're using identity and access management, which is called IAM, so that the administrators are now in a better position to be able to determine which users should be authorized to modify or otherwise engage with specific resources in the cloud.
Okay, but what are some of the approaches that companies can adapt to use IAM, or identity and access management, effectively?
Okay, well, it's critical enough that I think it bears repeating to say that investigations by multiple partners have revealed that in about 99% of cases, there are far too many, the permissions are far too lax. People are being given access to things that they shouldn't. So at very least, you should be separating your administrator and your user credentials. And then you need to limit the access within the cloud based on the roles and adopting least privilege guidelines, which has become the gold standards, becomes best practices today in terms of IT. You should also ensure that all identities are decommissioned or deprovisioned, depending on where you work, once they're no longer needed or that stakeholder has left the company. And frequently that doesn't happen either. To make this process a lot more effective and efficient, we find that it's good to centralize the management of those user credentials, something that today is being referred to as centralized IAM.
Now, you mentioned in that answer the least privilege, and that it's considered best IT practice today. Can you expand? What is it, and how does that differ from zero trust?
Well, in essence, with zero trust, nobody gets in anywhere until their bona fides have been verified. But once that trust has been established, then you want to use least privilege and that's something that's also known as minimum privilege, because when it's applied properly, it restricts an individual user or a group of users to the software or access of the network that they need, or access to the cloud that they need to actually perform their job and to do so well. Unfortunately, the vast majority of organizations don't apply the same stringent criteria to cloud access that they do to their network access. And as a result, the permissions for cloud often exceed what they need to do their job. by restricting access, you now limit not only do you limit where people can go, but if a threat vector worms its way into your system, you now limit where it can go to if that individual's credentials happen to get compromised.
When we spoke earlier this summer, Jane-Michèle, it was about changing cyber insurance compliance requirements. You indicated that multi-factor authentication, or otherwise known as MFA, was then an important tool in helping to protect corporate networks and endpoints. Does it also play a role in cloud security?
Oh, that's a very good point, as MFA is an excellent first line of defense. Unfortunately, it's not routinely enforced for cloud users the same way it is just for granting access to the network. Approximately, and this is a really weird number, approximately 3/4 of organizations do not have MFA on their consoles. Yet, 10% of successful breaches last year came from brute force attacks on consoles. Equally strange, scary, I'm not sure what the right word is there, but over half of firms do not require MFAs for their system administrators, who are vulnerable too. So as a starting point, it's highly recommended that some form of MFA software, and Cisco's Duo is a great choice, be adopted for all remote access, because the research shows that over close to 90% actually of organizations that fell victim to hackers in 2022 did so through their compromised emails, and they had no MFA protection on the key internet-facing systems, including their VPNs. It's also important to implement some form of multi-factor authentication internally, so that every time a user now moves perhaps to a different level platform where greater security is required or a different set of policies is put in place, they need to be verified again, and that doesn't always happen. This will give you a layered defense, which makes it a lot harder for threat vectors to successfully worm their way into your network, especially if you implement a least privileged approach.
From what you have explained so far, it appears that cyber criminals will follow different sets of tactics, techniques, and procedures. So what can and should companies be doing now to protect their cloud, edge, networks, and endpoints?
Yeah, it may seem overwhelming, but take a look at the slide in front of you, and what you'll see is there are 12 steps at least that companies can take to be able to protect themselves using MFA. I've got that at the top of the list for a very specific reason, because that is, we said, is one of the first lines of defense. Having the backups in place, having a comprehensive breach response plan, but also business continuity plans in place there. So in the event that your system goes down, how do you make sure that your business and your key systems continue to operate even without access to the internet or other parts of the network that you have going on? And this is something that you need to practice on a regular basis. We talked about having those disaster recovery protocols in place and to practice them regularly, going, right from scratch or bare metal in terms of what they're doing. Again, there are a lot of things that we talked about in terms of the least privileged approach. The one thing that we didn't talk about, though, is also having third generation tools that prevent dark web or tail scale networks from being able to connect to or from any part of your networks. That in itself can be a big deterrent to some of the cyber criminals. The security audit is also something you want to do. You start off with a security audit and then regularly you do penetration testing, because pen testing can be a good way of identifying new vulnerabilities that have crept in. And you want to make sure that the company that is doing your pen testing is not the same company that is responsible for your network security architecture, your network architecture and security, obviously. Installing antivirus programs on all of your endpoints, and AMP is a good tool to be able to use. I'm often asked, even a Mac? Mac's got great security, got great encryption and what have you. Yes, even on a Mac. And then implementing some form of EDR on all of your devices. And then the biggest thing is you want to make sure that you review your cyber insurance policies so that you can remain compliant, because if you get hacked and you're not compliant, it becomes a huge problem. Now, these are relatively simple, time-consuming in some cases, but simple steps to implement. And organizations that do so have a really good chance of staying at least one step ahead of the cyber criminals.
Jane-Michèle Clark, Director of Strategy for Cloud Managed Networks. Thanks very much for joining us.
Nick, thank you for asking me to be with you today. It truly has been a pleasure. And if anyone listening would like more information, please feel free to reach out to me.